to talk about premises. Premises are a big subject. The risks and rewards of ownership, people selling their buildings and leasing them back, new partners being unwilling to commit to buying into new buildings, all sorts of issues. So, advantages of owning your own premises. It can be profitable. I'd be really surprised. For the vast majority of practices, it is really profitable owning a building. So when I'm talking about profits, I'm talking about the amount of income from notional rent, from pharmacy rent, from cost rent, from other tenants, compared to the interest you pay on a loan for buying those premises. That's what we're talking about in terms of profit. But there will also be capital growth. The value of the building will go up over time. So it's not just the income, it's looking at capital growth as well. Normally, practices are a fantastic investment in terms of the buildings. What you've got to look at is when you're looking at the rent compared to the costs should be the interest on the mortgage only, not the capital repayments. Capital repayments are effectively saving for the future. You are increasing the equity by reducing the mortgage. That's not part of the profit. That's an enforced savings scheme. So in terms of the profit, it's just rent compared to interest. Now normally, when looking at that profit, you would not include the service charge. So there may be certain people who use rooms. So you might have chiropodists, you might have other people using rooms, and you charge them an amount per session. £40 a session. £50 per session? £60 a session? Who knows? However you justify that. That's a service charge, it's not rent. It can't be rent, because if you charge them rent, that will affect the reimbursement of your notional rent from NHS England. So it's got to be a service charge. That covers redecoration, covers cleaning, provision of equipment, management time, reception time, all those sorts of things. So it's a recharge of costs. Therefore, it's not profit. So you ignore those when looking at the profits. Now, in terms of tax, you pay tax on profits. So yes, for the partners who own the buildings, normally 40% taxpayers, they will pay 40% tax on the profits they make from property ownership. But the capital growth, the increase in the value of the property over time, won't be taxed at 40%. Generally speaking, it's taxed at 10%, if that. Because the way it works is you look at the cost of your share of the building when you bought it, and the value of your share when you sell it, you deduct your capital gains tax annual allowance, which is currently £11,700. And then if it's being sold on retirement or reducing sessions, the tax rate is only 10%. Bargain! That's the lowest rate of tax possible. So increasing value in the building, fantastic. Now, the reason it's only 10% is because of entrepreneurs' relief. The building is an asset which is used by the partnership. And as a partner, you are classed as an entrepreneur. Therefore, you get entrepreneurs' relief on the sale of assets used for the business. So that applies to buildings. Entrepreneurs' relief only applies in the case of retirement or reducing sessions. So if you get a full-time partner who then reduces to half-time, therefore sells a share of their ownership of the building, they qualify for entrepreneurs' relief. Where you are in an old building, you sell that old building and move to a brand new building, but none of the partners retire or reduce their sessions, you do not get the entrepreneurs' relief. And therefore the tax rate is doubled up to 20%. So in terms of premises, you need to be careful about timings of when things are done. Now in terms of profits, really good in terms of a secure stream of rental income. You get your notional rent, that's reassessed every 3 years. you get perhaps pharmacy rent. It will be being built into the lease that there will be guaranteed increases in your pharmacy rent, either based on CPI or RPI, so perhaps a 3-year increase. It may be linked to the number of patients, it may be linked to the number of scripts going through the pharmacy, but generally speaking, rental income, fantastic and really secure. What a lot of pharmacies do, however, is forget about rent reviews. Deliberately forget about rent reviews. So they may have signed up to a 21-year lease with 3 yearly rent review clauses. They will absolutely not change the standing order for the rent payments. It will be up to you, the practice, to keep an eye on when the rent reviews are due, and then formally instigate those rent reviews and invoice them for those rent arrears. Also, with a lot of pharmacy leases, there are certain costs which can be recharged to the pharmacy. Things particularly like a share of the property insurance. Now again, a lot of practices forget to recharge a share of that insurance. So you need to review your pharmacy leases, check when the review dates are, check when it can increase, and check that you're actually billing for things that you can under the pharmacy lease. Now in terms of premises, the other thing that practices need to think about is how the property is owned and shared between the partners. Now, normally there's 2 ways. It's either everyone has a share in the building, regardless of how many sessions they do. So you've got 4 partners, they own 1/4 of the building each. Or it's based on the number of sessions. So half-time partner would have a smaller share of the ownership of the building compared to a full-time partner. There are pros and cons. One of the downsides of doing it based on sessions is that every time there is a change in sessions, you need the building to be revalued at a cost, and then money's got to change hands between the partners. If someone's reducing their sessions, they get a payout. The remaining partners have to increase their share of the ownership, so they have to pay money in. If you're a large practice with partners constantly changing every few months the number of sessions they do, it can be a real pain. A real pain in terms of getting the valuations, getting everyone to agree, and extracting money out of partners where they're increasing their sessions. But if you own, say, 25% of the building each, there can also be issues. If you've got a large mortgage with big capital repayments, that means that has a much larger impact on part-time partners. It will have a much more proportionate decrease in their drawings compared to a full-time partner. So there are pros and cons, but it's something that partners need to look at, and partnerships should review on a regular basis. Now historically, if you've been a 4-partner practice with 4 full-time partners, actually things are bound to change, and you might want to reconsider how the property is owned between the partners. The other advantage of owning your own premises is control. No one can tell you, well, within reason, what you do with your own building. You can extend it, you can change the use of certain rooms, you can knock down walls, you can convert cupboards into offices, you can do all sorts of things. It's your building, and actually, within reason, you can do what you like, planning consent and everything else approved. You do get absolutely much more control in terms of when the building is repaired, in terms of all sorts of things. So huge advantage for partnerships in owning buildings. But new partners, it can be quite difficult persuading them that actually buying into this fantastically valuable asset is a good thing. Now, partnerships here who own their own buildings, how many have had issues with new partners questioning how to buy into the building, and is it worth it, and should I buy in, and actually turning down partnerships because they don't want to buy into the buildings? Yeah, a lot of you. It is a big issue. First thing I would say is that encourage your potential new partners to speak to your accountant, because we can give the facts and figures about what the impact is going to be in terms of the profit, in terms of the impact of capital repayments, in terms of all sorts of things. So encourage your reluctant new partners to speak to the accountants to find out how good it is to invest in practice premises. One big issue is the issue of negative equity or last man standing. Now, for some practices, this can be a huge issue, but it depends on where you are and what your building's like. So, if you are a practice who can't or haven't managed to recruit GPs and are thinking about handing back the contract, i.e. closing the practice, what value will your building have? Now, where there is a GP practice operating from the building, that will mean it sustains a level of value because there's a guaranteed stream of notional rent coming in, and that holds up the value of the building. If it's a completely empty building and you have to sell it on the open market, will there be a significant drop in the value of that building? Now, for new builds, yes, probably. For large purpose-built practices in small villages, yes, that will be a massive issue. No one is going to want to take on that building. If you're in a city, potentially the value of the land could be worth more than the value of your building, so it's not an issue. So it depends where you are and whether the building can be converted into something else. And that's one of the key things with practices looking at new builds, is how easy will it be to convert this building for alternative uses? Could this be turned into housing or offices or something else? So for new builds, for purely a financial perspective, you should encourage the architects to look at whether buildings can be converted into something else if it's no longer required for NHS purposes. But that's a real issue for new partners, is am I going to be left holding this £3 million building on my own when it's actually only worth £800,000 on the open market? Yes, that's an issue. The other issue is, if the practice building has been going up in value over the last few years and you've been making capital repayments on the mortgage, that will increase the equity in the building. New partners joining have to buy into that equity. So if there's £1 million of equity and they have to buy in, say, a quarter share of that, they've got to come up with £250,000. That could be quite off-putting for some people, for most people. But there are ways around that. First thing is, practices ought to consider remortgaging the building at certain times. So if you haven't remortgaged your building in a number of years, you might want to consider increasing the mortgage, which would reduce the equity, make it much easier for new partners buying in. They have much less to pay in. The other thing that partnerships can do is make a partnership loan available to that new partner. If they've got to come up with £250,000, rather than them going to the bank and saying, give me £250,000, the partnership can go to the bank and say, give the partnership £250,000. It will be a partnership loan, but the interest and capital repayments on that loan will all be charged to the new partner. So effectively it's working as a personal loan, but in name it's a partnership loan. That's likely to be A, much easier to get a loan because it will be a partnership loan. Interest rates are likely to be lower because it will be secured on the building, and it's much easier to do. And in terms of new partners coming in, it feels a lot easier doing it that way. Needs to be built in the partnership agreement though, how that's going to work, who's responsible for which proportion of which loans. So as long as that's all in the partnership agreement, absolutely fine. Some partners, potential partners, don't want to make a long-term commitment to the practice. Yeah, that can be an issue. But in terms of property ownership, it shouldn't be that difficult. Valuing a building, working out what the equity is when they join, them taking out a loan, buying in, and equally when partners leave, valuing the building, working out what the equity is, paying them out, that can happen relatively easily. So in terms of a potential new partner, yes, they can own bits in the building, and it isn't necessarily a long-term commitment. Current borrowings can be an issue. If you have an old style mortgage, say with Aviva, and the interest rate is say 11% fixed, Yes, that could be an issue for new partners joining. Why on earth would they want to take on a share of a mortgage where the interest rate is 11%? There's also an issue if you try and refinance those loans, those mortgages, because there will be massive redemption penalties on paying them off. That's what new partners don't want. They don't want to incur the redemption penalties, they don't want to pay 11% interest. So yeah, that can be a massive issue. If you do refinance, you do get tax relief on redemption penalties. So there is a slight benefit there. Poor state of existing premises. Yeah, if you've got crappy premises which haven't had any money spent on them for years, a potential new partner walking through the door is going to think, I've got to pick up my share of all the repair costs on this, in terms of resurfacing the car park, a new roof, complete internal redecoration. That's really going to put partners off, potential partners off. Practices ought to have a regular budget to spend on premises improvements and maintenance. You should have a rolling programme of maintenance so you don't get into that situation. In terms of property ownership though, you've got to look at who's going to incur those repair costs. Normally, the tenants are responsible for paying internal repair costs. So if a new partner joins, refuses to be a property owner, and you say, okay, you can join and you don't have to be a property owner, they've still got to pick up a share of repair costs. So new carpets, internal redecoration, they will still pick up a share of those costs. Right, property leases. If some of the current partners own the building, the ownership of that building will be covered by the partnership agreement, and there is absolutely no need for a separate lease. What happens if one of the partners retires and you can't come to an agreement about buying their share of the building? New partner doesn't want to buy in, continuing partners don't want to buy their share. Suddenly you're left with a retired partner who owns part of the building. You need a lease. Quite often there will be a period where you will be forgiven for not having a lease, but normally that only lasts a year, 18 months, and after that time you ought to have a formal lease. Obviously, if you're renting from an external landlord, there will need to be a lease, and the banks have a big say in whether a lease is required where you have an ex-partner, because they may say, actually, current partners don't own all of this building, therefore unless you get a formal lease drawn up, we are immediately requiring repayment of the mortgage. And banks can do that under the terms of the loan agreements. There are costs associated with leases. In some cases, really quite substantial costs. So, professional fees. There will be legal fees in drawing up a lease. Now, depending on the solicitors you use, yeah, it could be a few £1,000s. Sometimes it goes into tens of thousands of pounds depending on who owns the building and what lease is required. Stamp duty land tax, SDLT. Anyone heard of it? If you're leasing a building, you should have heard of it. Stamp duty land tax. Normally you would only think you pay stamp duty on buying a building. So you buy a house, you pay stamp duty. Actually, there's stamp duty land tax when you sign a lease on a building. Who's paid stamp duty land tax on the lease of a building? Not many. Right, it can be a huge amount of money. It's calculated based on the amount of rent you're paying, the length of the lease, and a lot of times it can go into tens of thousands of pounds in terms of stamp duty. Who pays that stamp duty? it's the tenant, it's the occupier of the building, it's the practice that pays that stamp duty. It is not the owner of the building. So if you have a retired partner who refuses to sell their share of the building and you need to enter into a lease with them, not only will the practice end up with the legal costs of the lease, they will end up having to pay the stamp duty on the lease as well. So that's a big issue. Also, you'll need to update the partnership agreement, because normally ownership of premises is dealt with through the partnership agreement. Well, if you have a lease, that's a completely separate legal agreement, so you will need to update the partnership agreement to remove the clauses about property ownership. Dilapidations. Normally, with leases, at the end of the term of the lease, you have to return the building in the state that you received it when you started the lease. So if you have a brand new building you are leasing from a third-party landlord, there may be significant dilapidations clauses requiring you to redecorate the building throughout before you hand back the building, to recarpet, to do all sorts of things to the building. Equally, that will apply where you have a new lease, where you are entering into that because you've got an ex-partner owning a share of the building. You should have a detailed report from a surveyor on the condition of the building at the time that lease is signed, setting out exactly what state the building was in, and you will be required to return the building in that same state. Leases also may have clauses about how many times you have to redecorate the building, internally and externally, what you're responsible for in terms of repair costs. So dilapidations you need to consider very carefully. It can run into hundreds of thousands of pounds. The other issue with dilapidations is if you change things internally in the building, add in new partition walls, for example, or move a wall or remove a wall, quite often you have to reinstate that building back to how it was originally. So remove all your new partition walls, rebuild the walls that you had demolished, and the building has to be returned in exactly the same state it was when you took out the lease. So you need to be very careful with dilapidations clauses in leases. Right, break clauses. What's a break clause? Break clause is where you are allowed to stop that lease. By giving 6 months notice normally, you can break that lease. So you might have a 25-year lease, but it might have 5-year break clauses, which means every 5 years you can give notice and say, right, I no longer want to occupy this building. That works really well in normal agreements. NHS buildings are not normal buildings. The issue you have is that all leases have to be approved by NHS England. If the lease is not approved by NHS England, they will not reimburse you the rent. So, NHS England do not like break clauses at all. They want that building to be provided for primary care for a group of registered patients for the next 25 years. They are not going to approve a lease where you have 5-year break clauses. So that has to be quite a difficult negotiation sometimes with the landlords. Other lease issues: who is responsible for the costs? Who is going to be responsible for appointing contractors to carry out work, so repair costs, and how are any service charges going to be charged to the tenants? Now, normally if you are the only person in a building, it's not an issue. You can deal with all of that on behalf of your landlord. Where you have a building which is occupied by 3 or 4 different people, service charges can be a massive issue. Quite often the landlord will charge huge service charges for recharging each of the tenants a share of the costs. Particularly if you are in an NHS-owned building. So NHS Property Services buildings, incredibly expensive in terms of service charges. Massive service charges. They will even charge a service charge on administering the council tax, i.e. taking the council tax bill, photocopying it, emailing it to you. They charge you 20% of the council tax for doing that. Shocking. you need to be really careful about service charges. As I say, NHS England need to approve all leases. You've got to get them involved early. They can take months to approve a lease. So if you are negotiating with an ex-partner about the lease terms, make sure you get NHS England involved early. Otherwise, you could suddenly find you've signed a lease, you're paying rent to your ex-partner, and actually no rent reimbursement is coming in from NHS England. You also need to be very clear about the rent review procedures. How often is the rent going to be reviewed? Well, it ought to be 3 yearly to coincide with notional rent reviews, and it ought to be linked to the district valuer's assessment of the notional rent. You don't want to end up in a situation where you're paying out 120 grand a year in rent, but you're only receiving 90 grand reimbursement from NHS England. There should be no automatic increases in rent every 3 years. The lease should also provide that rent can go down as well as up, because notional rent can go down. And you don't want to be stuck in a situation where you've agreed £100,000 for the rent, and then 3 years later, district valuer says, well, actually, we only think it's worth 90 grand now, but you are stuck because your lease will not allow you to put the rent down. So you've got to be really careful on your rent review clauses. Who's done a sale and leaseback? There are some people in this room I know who have done sale and leasebacks. So a sale and leaseback is where you own the building. You decide, actually, we don't want this building anymore, it's too much hassle, we're not quite sure about new partners buying in, we've come to the end of our mortgage, let's just flog the building. So people like Assura are really keen on buying GP practice premises. So yay, let's go to Assura, let's flog our building, we can relax now, we don't own the building, we don't have a mortgage, rent's all covered by NHS England, nothing to worry about. Potentially, other than the fact that you've signed up to a lease. Now, that lease that you sign will normally be at least 20 years, probably 25 years. Your partners are signing up to paying rent for the next 25 years, regardless of whether they hold an NHS contract or not. To me, that's a much bigger risk than owning the buildings. Because if you own the buildings, at least you've got something to sell if things go wrong. If you lease a building, all you're doing is paying rent for the next 25 years. So depending on the building, depending on the amount of rent, that can be a big risk. The other issue is people like Assura come along and they give really good valuations. So if a partnership changes, your building might have been valued at £1 million. Actually, Assura will come along and say, we'll pay you 1.2 million. Great! And that is great. But what you've got to factor in is there may be redemption penalties on your mortgage, which could be 200 grand. So that eats into that profit. There'll then be legal fees. Sale and leaseback should be straightforward, but it never is. You've got to get the lease approved by NHS England. It can take months. Solicitors' fees can rack up to £40,000-50,000 in terms of arranging a sale and leaseback. You've then got stamp duty to pay, which could be £20,000-30,000. You've then got capital gains tax to pay. The partners have sold the building. That immediately triggers the payment and the calculation of any capital gains tax. So actually there are some big financial issues in terms of sale and leasebacks. Take legal advice and accountancy advice. Sometimes the lawyers will say, yes, this will work brilliantly, but actually you need to know how it will work in terms of pounds and pence. It's not just a legal issue, it's financial. So, what are the advantages of a sale and leaseback? Immediate cash injection. Yes, the partners are thinking, great. Mortgage is only 600,000. Assura are going to pay us 1.2 million. Yay, 600 grand. We'll pay off the mortgage and run off with the money. That is a big issue. The partners will run off with the money. And when I say run off, they will immediately hand in their notice and disappear with their 150 grand from the building, and they'll take their pension early. It absolutely happens. So in a lot of the cases where we've seen sale and leasebacks, at least 70% of the partners leave within 6 months of the building being sold. And then the remaining partners, they're going, we've signed up to pay rent for the next 25 years, how on earth are we going to deal with this? And that's a massive issue. So, yeah, you do get an immediate cash injection, which will encourage some partners to disappear into the sunset. Yeah, you get this high valuation from Assura, but that will be eroded by lots of costs. Potentially, it's much more attractive to new partners. They haven't got to take out a £300,000 personal loan for buying in. Fantastic. They've just got to sign on the dotted line to say they'll pay rent for the next 25 years. Some new partners won't factor in their thinking. They won't realise the long-term implications of paying rent for the next 25 years. So it's much easier for new partners. They don't have to go to the bank, they don't have to arrange a mortgage, they don't have that financial responsibility. All they've got to do is sign on the lease. It does put all partners on the same footing. It's really difficult in a partnership where you've got some property owners and some non-property owners. Massively difficult. Who's going to pay for the new carpet? Is that going to be the property owners? Are you improving the property? Or is that a repair cost which ought to be borne by all partners? Who's going to pay for the new extension? Who's going to pay for new windows? Who's going to pay for the lift repair? Where you've got partners who are property owners and non-property owners, it can be a real issue. Actually, flogging off the building and having a third-party landlord, everyone's in the same boat. All the partners are in the same boat, so much less of an issue. One thing to think about with sale and leaseback is who's going to pay for any renovations? Who's going to pay for any building works in future? Who's going to pay for any extensions in future? That's difficult. And with a sale and leaseback, actually, it won't affect any of the staff or patients. They don't need to know about it. Well, they might know about it when their partners run out the door with their 150 grand, but hey. So yeah, sale and leaseback. You are selling your main asset. That will trigger capital gains tax, and that's something the partners don't think about. They assume there'll be some tax when they leave the practice. Actually, if they carry on in practice but sell the building, there will be capital gains tax to pay. The other major thing is that I've been talking about the profits that you make from owning the building. Well, you sell the building, you lose those profits, those ongoing profits. You don't get the ongoing profit from the notional rent. You don't get the profit from the pharmacy rent. Now, for some practices we're dealing with at the moment who are looking at sale and leaseback, the rental profit is 30% of their total income. They do a sale and leaseback, yeah, they might get some cash back. They're losing 30% of their ongoing profits, which is a huge amount, huge risk. Other things to think about, redemption penalties. Yep, if you sell off your building, you then have to repay the mortgage. If you've got a fixed rate mortgage, that may come with quite hefty redemption fees. In certain cases, new landlords can take on that existing mortgage, but very unusual, particularly where there's high rates of interest involved. Disadvantages of sale and leaseback, yeah, there will be regular maintenance costs. You will be required to do certain things to that building for the landlord at regular intervals. Dilapidations at the end of the lease, ripping out partitions, that's a massive cost. One of the major downsides there, in practical things, is you need to ask your landlord's permission formally in writing before you do anything to the building. You can't put a partition wall in. You can't block up a doorway. You can't put in automatic doors. You can't put white lines in the car park. Anything without seeking the landlord's permission. And depending on who your landlord is, it can take months to get any sort of agreement. So it does make managing the property a lot more difficult. And again, you've got the issues of NHS approval for the new lease. So that's an end to my little spiel. So I've covered new contract and premises. So now, sorry, I'm having a break now. I've overrun, have I? Yes. Significantly?
Only about
30 minutes. Okay. Coffee time. If you've got any questions about the new contract or premises, then just call me either at the break or at lunchtime. Thank you.